1 week until the election in British Columbia. Recent polls show a tightening up of the race there, although not yet enough to save the BC Liberal government. Premier Christy Clark, though, campaigning to save her political life, as NDP leader Adrian Dix is taking damage for a perceived flip-flop on a pipeline, and the Green Party hoping to win a few seats and gain official party status. Standing by with his eye on what's going to happen next Tuesday in Victoria, our BC political commentator Michael Geoghegan is standing by live. Michael, let's talk about these polls tightening up and the fact that Adrian Dix might have made a strategic mistake by running what I guess his party thought was a slam dunk here.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Todd. They were more concerned about the Greens because they were so far ahead of the Liberals. And on Earth Day, Adrian Dix did a flip-flop. He went from, we'll let the process take its course in terms of the twinning of the Kinder Morgan pipeline to suddenly saying, I don't want to see increased tanker traffic off the coast of Vancouver, so I'm now opposed to the twinning. And that is something that the Liberals were able to capitalize on and to say, hey, look, it's going to be the 90s all over again with the NDP driving away investment and jobs. And now the Liberals are running as very much attacking Adrian Dix in terms of his perceived lack of economic leadership.
Yeah, I want to bring up the poll board if we can, just to sort of show the viewers a recent aggregation of polls here that shows about a 7.5, 8-point spread between the NDP and the Liberals. At one point, as you know, Michael, it was 22 points, give or take. This flip-flop on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, I mean, just a little bit more on that if we can, has done some damage to the NDP.
Well, it was a tough decision for Adrian Dix because, he knew that it would probably help the Liberals, but what he was more worried about was the Greens. And back in April, the Greens were running ahead of the Liberals on Vancouver Island, and he was worried that the Greens would elect some MLAs, and then he heads into a second term or trying for a second term with the Greens as a viable option, splitting his vote on the left. So I think he was trying to head off the Greens, but I think he's done more to resuscitate the Liberal fortunes than he did to diminish the Green ability to elect some MLAs.
Let's talk charisma factor. Adrian Dix versus Christy Clark. I'm hearing that Adrian Dix is not quite the same type of campaigner as the Premier is.
No, Adrian Dix historically was, very much a political staffer. I mean, he was Glenn Clark's chief of staff. He was a ministerial assistant before then. Christy Clark, she had been high profile as a minister of education. She'd been a deputy premier. She stepped out for a term. During that time, she was on a radio station in Vancouver. She ran for mayor, and although she wasn't elected, she kept her profile very high. And, one thing you can certainly see is, Adrian Dix is that classic example of a politician who likes to govern but hates campaigning. Christy Clark's the reverse. She loves campaigning. Governing, not so much something she enjoys. Well, I mean, she enjoys being in power, but, her real forte is on the campaign trail.
There's this whole narrative of the BC Liberals under Christy Clark, being tired and out of steam and scandal-ridden. But for folks in BC with a longer political memory, of course, some of them are going to remember, as you do, back in the 90s, 10 years under Mike Harcourt, then Glenn Clark, the NDP government there, scandals and lots of criticism about financial mismanagement of the province by the NDP.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing where there's been no shortage of scandals, of course, under the Liberals. I mean, the biggest one being the BC Rail scandal and the political interference over the sale of BC Rail to CN, and then there was a couple of ministerial assistants that were caught up, and it ended up being before the courts. The NDP, I mean, going back in the day, there was a number of scandals that erupted. Interestingly enough, today on the front page of the local paper, looks like a new scandal has erupted involving the Ministry of Health. The Therapeutics Initiative, a bunch of people were fired as contractors. One of them then died, and it is rumored, although not known, that he may or may not have committed suicide, but it was certainly a short time after he was fired that he was found dead. So very serious, and the allegation that's come out today is that they were terminated in part because they were uncovering some potentially very negative side effects associated with certain medications. Pharmaceutical companies have been big donors to the BC Liberals. They're alleging that that had something to do with their termination. So that's on the front page of today's paper. Whether or not that has any impact on voting, we'll also have to see.
Yeah, this drug researcher claiming in these court documents that the government tried to silence him. We'll have to see how that plays out in the next couple of days. I also want to get your take on the Green Party. You know, they are eyeing official party status, especially on the island. How is that sort of playing out here? You and I were talking earlier about the idea of a minority government for Adrian Dix. That would only work if the Greens kind of surge and are able to take a couple of seats away from him. What's your take on that dynamic?
Yeah, the only minority government scenario that would work is one where, you know, the Greens have won a handful of seats, and the NDP are, you know, and that's what's required for the NDP to overtake the Liberals. So it would be a situation where maybe the Liberals are ahead by one seat, the Greens have 3 or 4 seats, and they ally with the NDP for a minority government. I think that's a very unlikely scenario. I think a much more likely scenario is that you'll still see an NDP majority, Liberals a close opposition, so they're going to be a very strong opposition, but you may see a Green MLA or 2 elected. And that, as I alluded to earlier, that will be difficult for the NDP, you know, in the next election, because then it's a situation where they have a split on the left rather than, you know, the Liberals facing a split on their right.
Never a dull moment in British Columbia politics, eh, Michael?
Oh, no, it's very interesting.
Thanks so much for your time.